Hello, everybody. We are back for the last North American hosted presentation of the day. Alyson Intihar from Florida Tech will be presenting about the effects of the teaching interactions procedure on esports coaches' feedback delivery. We look forward to your presentation, Alyson, and we look forward to getting questions for you in the Twitch chat. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Hello, everyone. My name is Alyson Intihar. I am a doctoral student at the Florida Institute of Technology, otherwise known as Florida Tech, but I'm also a behavioral performance coach for Florida Tech Esports, and I'm going to be presenting on today my master's thesis, The Effects of the Teaching Interactions Procedure on Esports Coaches' Feedback Delivery. So to kind of set the scene for everyone, I want to talk about the current state overall of esports research. So Reitman et al. 2020 did a literature review of 150 articles across 7 different disciplines. Now, the majority of studies reviewed in this particular review were observational. There were not as many experimental manipulations. This really emphasizes the need for direct implementation with players, and they also specifically discussed more fields need to come in and contribute their own research, methodologies, findings in order to benefit the esports population. And one field that was not represented in the review that has been doing some preliminary work with esports that I've been a big part of is behavior analysis. So what is behavior analysis? So behavior analysis is the science of learning and human behavior developed by B.F. Skinner around the 1960s. We're very much focused on using evidence-based practices to improve behaviors of social significance. We work of various different fields overall, basically any kind of human population you can think of, but our most common ones are the autism or developmental disabilities population. A lot of our clinical work and a lot of our research foundation is with that population. We've also done some work in the business sector in our subsector called the organizational behavior management, but we've also done quite a bit of work in sports. So for traditional sports, we've done quite a bit of work, as I said, and this is a review I'm going to talk about real briefly to kind of see what exactly we have done with traditional sports. So Schenk and Miltenberger 2019 conducted a literature review with 101 total studies across 21 different traditional sports and had 23 different behavioral interventions used. So the most common category of intervention in this review was feedback. And among the most common interventions overall was verbal feedback and what we call positive and negative reinforcement, which considering what causes behavior change is reinforcement, and verbal feedback is very, very common in the sports and a lot of different kinds of areas. This is not very surprising. But what's really interesting is the majority of these interventions were packaged together in a treatment package, meaning there wasn't as many investigations of just one intervention by itself. So my study, as the title implies, focused on feedback delivery. So why would I select feedback aside from it being very, very common in the sports sector? So number one, feedback has been shown in the literature across various fields that improves performance. Without feedback and continued feedback, players or any kind of individual is not going to maintain the same high level of performance over time for the most part. It also establishes important communication between parties. In the esports context, this is very often between a coach and their players, so the players know how exactly they are performing. But much like many other coaching skills, feedback delivery is often not trained directly, meaning that a lot of people do not know how to deliver feedback that in a way that is most effective and supported by the literature. So that is why I decided to focus on training this specific skill. So behavior analysis has many different ways to train skills, and two of the most popular ones that are very similar but have some differences is TIP, or the Teaching Interactions Procedure, and behavioral skills training, or BST. So they both have modeling of the skill, basically that you have someone either on a video or live perform the skill that you want them to do. You have rehearsal, which allows the trainee to get to practice the skill. And then you have feedback, ironically enough, where they get to have feedback come in and see how they did on their performance, often listing steps in a particular skill set that they do and they don't do correctly. But the difference between BST and TIP is that BST includes specific instructions, while TIP goes in a little bit more in depth. It labels and identifies the skill that you are teaching. It provides a rationale or a reason why you should learn how to do this. It breaks down the skill into smaller component skills, and it also includes a demonstration of examples and non-examples. Now, BST is considered the golden standard of training research in behavior analysis. It has been shown to be effective across a wide variety of skills and a wide variety of populations, while TIP has been not investigated as much. Hence, it is really important for us to see, can TIP have similar results to BST with its more in-depth style of training? So there's a lot of different literature gaps that I've noticed throughout my time reading the literature. This is, of course, esports and behavior analysis. A lot of our work is very preliminary, and we're working on publishing a bunch of different studies, including this one, the teaching interactions procedure overall, as well as feedback delivery training. And finally, in naturalistic settings. So many studies, as we know, are usually conducted in controlled environments that are not as applicable to real life situations that those participants might face. So trying to have a study take place in an environment that is as naturalistic as possible is really important to evaluate. So the aims of my project were to evaluate the effectiveness of a behavioral method to teach feedback delivery, train esports coaches evidence-based feedback delivery skills, and expand upon the literature of empirical esports research. So I want to now discuss the design of my study, which was a multiple baseline across participants design. This is a single subject design, which is the main type of design that behavior analysis uses in our research. This involves repeated measures over time with individual participants serving as their own controls. We have behaviors that are operationally defined and that we graph on a line graph, and that we have procedures that are very precise and that can be replicated across multiple individuals. This helps to control internally validity threats, along with, again, as I said, individual participants serving as their own controls. So for an example of what a multiple baseline design looks like, you can see here that on the boxes, you can see that we have all the participants in what we probably call our baseline phase, which is essentially them performing the skill without any kind of training whatsoever, just to see where they're at. And you can see that the level of the baseline, or the number of sessions, increases depending on the participant. It staggers out. And then we see that only when we switch to our intervention phase, that behavior does actually change. So no matter how long your baseline is, our behavior should not change until we actually incorporate our independent variable. So the participants for my study were 3 coach-player triads. So we had one esports coach paired up with 2 players. The coaches for this study, we used Rocket League as the game for this study. And the reason we used this for this preliminary investigation was due to Rocket League being the collegiate esport that has the shortest game duration. Because the main thing we wanted to focus on was not necessarily the player's behavior, but more the coach's behavior of them providing feedback. So all the coaches that we recruited were not exactly Rocket League coaches, but they knew of Rocket League and knew how it worked. 2 of the coaches were board certified behavior analysts, which during that training to get a board certified behavior analyst certification, one of them does include some of the elements of perhaps feedback delivery, but a lot of them, of course, they would not have been selected for the study if they already had the skill that we are trying to teach. Because again, as I said, many people know how to deliver feedback, but perhaps not to the way that is supported by the literature. The players in the triads were Rocket League players, and they had varying levels of experience. Some of them were completely new to the game. Some of them have been on a varsity or junior varsity team for years. So that actually is very good to have, as often coaches will have to work with a ton of different kinds of players in the collegiate space. We actually conducted the study 100% in Discord remotely. We had a special server created just for the study. And in the study, we had 2 players play Rocket League live with their mics on and their screens on so the coach could watch. The head researcher was there to observe. And then the coach provided feedback to the players in real time right after the game concluded. And then the head researcher took data on the coach's performance. So our primary dependent variables that we looked at was the percentage of component feedback delivery skills. So we broke up feedback delivery into 6 component skills that all had specific criteria that had to be met. And this was measured via what we call a task analysis, which is, in other words, a checklist. So if they met all the requirements for one of the skills, we would check that off. Our mastery criterion, or the level of performance that we wanted them to reach to consider the skill of mastered, originally at the start of our study was 100%. But then after we got to a certain point, we realized that perhaps that 100% was not necessarily appropriate, that some of the feedback delivery skills perhaps didn't always need to be included for every single delivery to be effective. So then that was changed to about 80% across 3 consecutive sessions. So they had to make 80% or higher 3 times in a row to advance. So the skills that we targeted was specific feedback, meaning that they had to give specific 1 positive and 1 corrective instance of feedback to each player individually in the group and had to be accurate to what they did during the game. After every instance of positive feedback, they had to provide a praise statement. Then rationale and instruction. So for every time that the coach gave corrective feedback, they needed to provide a both rationale for how they should for why they should care about this behavior, as well as an instruction of how to change. They also had to go over the post-game statistics in Rocket League for each player of their performance. They also needed to provide an opportunity for the player to ask questions. And then they had to end the session on a positive note. As we know, feedback can potentially be really uncomfortable for some people. So ending on a positive, such as saying, thank you for listening to my feedback. Hope you do well in the next game, can be really, really helpful to combat that uncomfortableness they may feel. We also decided as a secondary measure to look at feedback delivery frequency. So we looked at to see the number of positive versus corrective feedback statements that the coaches were making to see if our training had any impact on that performance. Our independent variable was the teaching interactions procedure, which was delivered vocally by the head researcher with the aid of a PowerPoint. We labeled and identified the skill being taught, provided a rationale on when they should provide feedback, which is ideally as soon as possible after the game concludes. Then we provided them the task analysis with all of our definitions, as well as a rationale and explanation for every single component skill. And then we did a video demonstration of examples and not examples, where they were shown each component skill individually as an example of what to do, and then a non-example, and then an entire performance as to what to do and what not to do. We allowed the coaches to practice feedback delivery via role play, and then they were provided feedback by the lead researcher in terms of what components they were including and what they didn't include. So the study had a multitude of different phases that I'm going to be now going through for the next part of the presentation. So we conducted a pre-study with our Confederate players in the triads just to see what their overall opinion was on receiving feedback from their coaches. Though, again, note, none of the participants in the study had worked with these players previously. But generally, they were very satisfied from the feedback they received from their coaches, though they did request more individual feedback in a group setting and for their coaches to not make any assumptions about their in-game knowledge. So this is the graph. I know it is quite complicated, but I'm going to be breaking it down for us. So on the x-axis, we have our sessions, which was each instance that the coach provided feedback. On the left y-axis, which corresponds to our data points, is the percentage of task analysis steps included, while the right y-axis is correlated with the bar graph, where we have each of the task analysis item numbers. So you can see not only on the graph the percentage, you can also see, for example, which numbers they were including and not including. So for example, you can see on the first data path for Colleen here, you can see that they included step 1 as well as step 5, but none of the other components. So the first thing we did was what we call a generalization probe, where the coaches were to give feedback before the study even started to players who weren't in their assigned group, just to kind of see where they were. And the most that they were able to provide on average was about 2 of the 6 steps. Then during baseline, they were just asked to deliver feedback as they normally would. This was with their assigned groups. And as you can see, the most, again, they were able to do was only 2 steps. So the majority of them sometimes even only including 1 of the steps correctly or none at all. Then we had the teaching interactions procedure, and then we tested them on another session after that training was concluded. And as you can see here, for Ashley was able to meet our mastery criterion after without any additional aid, while for Colleen and Tom, they could not. But there was an improvement between baseline and TIP, meaning that TIP did have an effect. This means that Colleen and Tom required some additional assistance. So for them, it was including back the feedback component of TIP, where they were provided after every performance, which items they were including correctly and which ones they were not including correctly. We then conducted one more generalization probe, just the same as we did at the beginning. And you can see here that they maintain mastery levels with novel people. And then 2 weeks after our training had concluded, we conducted a maintenance probe. It was identical to baseline conditions just to see if they could still perform the skill to mastery levels. And as you can see, they were successful at doing so. This is our feedback frequency graph. We have our sessions on the X and our feedback frequency on the Y. So for Colleen was providing more corrective feedback than positive feedback, while Tom and Ashley were providing more positive feedback. And after our training, we can see that the preference only shifted for Colleen, where not only did we see a higher frequency of positive feedback statements, we can also see in general that just the switch happened from the preference, though that wasn't the case for Tom or Ashley. And this trend's even continued to be seen even after at the end of the study, as well as when the other two participants reached our maintenance and gen probes. We then conducted social validity surveys with both our coaches as well as our Confederate players. So they were anonymous 3-item surveys with Likert scale questions as well as an open-ended question. So we got some mixed results from the 3 coaches. One of the coaches who had the most experience, they were a coach for Overwatch, said they really, really liked the training method and they really thought it was useful. One of the other coaches who primarily had worked with League of Legends said that they weren't really sure. They were kind of in the middle, not quite sure how to feel about it. While another coach who worked with a multiple of different sports said that they didn't really like it for them, which is to be expected. Sometimes a particular training method may be effective, but doesn't always mean it vibes well for every single participant. So we also conducted a study of the Confederate players. One of the things that we asked them is if they noticed any improvement from the when they started the study to the end, and pretty much all of them said they thought there was an increase in the coach's feedback, and they really liked that the feedback that they were getting. They especially liked that they were given, again, that individual feedback in that group setting, which is something that they often don't see, right? Because coaches often have a very limited time that they can provide feedback during games. So it's really important to teach them, as we did in the study, how to provide feedback in that group setting that is individual to the player. So our overall results. So all our participants were able to reach mastery, though 2 of them required the feedback to be added back in. This is not very surprising, as in our literature is shown that in order to keep high level performance, as well as potentially to even reach high levels of performance, ongoing feedback and monitoring is very much necessary. We then again saw that feedback shift preference for one of our coaches, and we had some mixed social validity surveys. So what are the overall implications of this? This shows the value of behavior analysis in esports. Our methodology, again, is one that we are all about increasing behaviors of social significance, and there's so much more untapped potential that we haven't gotten to yet. I'm actually working on my dissertation project in esports as well, with teaching players how to respond to feedback. There's so many things that we can do, especially to support coaches, because many times esports players who become a coach often aren't given some kind of formal education how to become a coach. It's very similar to a lot of teachers, right? They say teaching is one of the jobs that you don't necessarily learn how to do. You just learn the subject and you kind of learn how to teach as you go. Coaching for esports, at least as of right now, seems to be very similar in a lot of places. It shows that there is an effective way to teach feedback and the necessary of including ongoing feedback. And another really important thing is that this training was very low cost. A lot of esports programs have very limited funding, and often a training like this, to have someone come in and work on an additional skill, can cost a lot of extra money from a consultant. But this was very low cost, using free to use programs or very accessible programs, and again, right in Discord. So it was very, very easy for them to implement and potentially to replicate. And again, a really big one, the study was completely remote. A lot of esports work is remote, where we sometimes have coaches training our players from halfway across the world. And a lot of esports competition is online. So the fact we were able to do this in that naturalistic environment in Discord, I think is really, really valuable and makes the training methodology a lot more accessible, which is a big, big thing that I think is really important. So those are my two references. And if you would like to contact me, this is my email. I'm also going to put the email of my advisor and the head of our lab, the EC Dr. Caitlin Goki, who was also one of my advisors during the process of this study, as well as my dissertation advisor working on more esports research. And now I will open the floor to any questions. Thank you all for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alyson.
Thank you.
I don't see questions in the chat right now, but we'll give people a second to add them. While we're waiting, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you're hoping for in your next steps? I know you nodded to where this research is going, but would be happy to hear more about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that we would like to do as a future replication, as this was a very preliminary study in the context of a thesis, as you know, thesis research often has a lot of limitations. We would love to get to replicate this with coaches giving feedback in their own game. So for example, having an Overwatch coach provide live feedback to Overwatch players, especially players perhaps they don't even know. So that's one of the things we could do. Another thing that we talked about is perhaps modifying our definitions per title. For example, the post-game statistics may not be as relevant for different titles. For example, they might be more relevant, let's say, maybe for League of Legends versus Rocket League versus Overwatch. It's going to depend on the coach. Another thing that we got feedback about is about potentially the strictness of our definition. So perhaps they don't need to give praise for every single positive feedback statement, maybe as long as that's included. Again, that could be one thing that we can do. Another thing that I think we'd like to do is potentially expand this to a whole group, so a full team instead of just 2 players, to teach coaches expand further how to provide feedback to an entire group instead of just a duo. That would require a lot more participants, and I think potentially that could be really, really cool.
I can see that being really interesting because, of course, you want a coach to be providing similar feedback to all players, at least in terms of how they feel supported, right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm still not seeing any questions, so I think we will probably break really early. Alyson, thank you so much for